First, I want to say that I'm really grateful to this report that you wrote. The executive summary is this little handout that you got. The full report is available online, at least by the end of the day it will be. And it's about a 60-page report. It represents a lot of work, probably about 3 years, during which Lamin has worked in putting this together. Coming in as the president of PILnet in December, I didn't know a whole lot about PILnet's history in building a culture of pro bono in Europe. And in reading Lamin's report, I learned a lot about the organization that I'm heading. And I think all of you who've played a role in helping to build this culture will discover that there's a lot in this report that reflects, in a very systematic way, an overview of this effort that you have helped to bring about. So we wanted to take a few moments and talk to Lamin about the report, about how it came about and some of the things he found in it. But just so that you know who Lamin is a pro bono associate at DLA, pro bono associate for continental Europe, works here in the Amsterdam office, where he assists the director for pro bono, Oscar Khadar, to support the pro bono work in, I believe, 26 offices in Europe. And before that, Lamin was the executive director of the public interest clinic at NYU, and one of the co-founders of the Good Lobby. He's also a PhD student, and as part of his PhD research has been looking into the development of pro bono. Lamin, why don't I start out by asking you to tell us a little bit about how this report came about, what motivated you, and who did you speak to? How did you gather the information for this report?
Sure, thanks for the introduction. So the report came about through my PhD research into public interest law in Europe, because in addition to pro bono, there's a much wider public interest law movement in Europe, and PILnet played a very big part in that. And so during the course of my PhD, I got to undertake a Fulbright in the US, and PILnet was gracious enough to host me for 3 months in their New York offices, where I was digging through your archives, and I'm pretty sure many people thought I was a spy of some kind. But to thank PILnet, and because it was directly relevant for my research, I agreed with Marianne that I would write this report looking specifically at pro bono in Europe. And PILnet, Marianne, Atanas, and everyone else kindly introduced me to all of the people who have been involved in building up the pro bono community in Europe. And I interviewed around 50 or 60 of them over the course of the past year and a half. People from, not only from law firms, but also from clearinghouses and nonprofit organizations. And that's kind of, many of those people are probably in this room today, so thank you. And that's how I got the information for the report.
Great. So let's talk about just some of the main things that you learnt in putting this report together about the development of pro bono in Europe over the past 15 years or so. Just sort of the main conclusion.
Sure. So actually, one of the most interesting things I found, and the reason why the report became so long, is that pro bono in Europe actually has a really deep, rich, and very long history, commencing a very long time ago in ancient Greece through to the Republic in Rome, through to the medieval ages, as has already been touched upon. But particularly in the 1800s and early 1900s, lawyers in Europe right across the continent, from no country is excepted, have been involved in some fantastically creative, innovative projects aimed at promoting access to justice in their countries. And pretty much any country you look at in Europe, wherever there has been a legal profession, there have been lawyers self-organizing and engaging in projects aimed at providing access to justice for low-income or no-income individuals. And actually, one of the other interesting findings is that as state-sponsored legal aid systems emerged during the course of the 20th century, that did had two effects on pro bono practice in Europe. On the one hand, it massively expanded access to justice for individuals right across the continent, but at the same time, it also meant that there was a sort of functional separation in European legal professions, whereby a large portion of the profession, those not funded by the state, started to neglect their pro bono practice, or distance themselves, or feel that they were no longer required to be involved in providing pro bono. So legal aid had a kind of a dampening effect on the pro bono ethos in Europe. And that was the case up until around the 1990s, when pro bono really started to take off in Europe. And that has been thanks to many of the people in this room and the emergence of large corporate firms with massive headcounts and huge global footprints and many offices in Europe. And individuals within those firms working together with PILnet and other clearinghouses across the continent to actually build up pro bono practice. And so the history of pro bono over the last 15 years is really a story of dedicated individuals building a community of believers and institutions and organizations supportive of pro bono.
I was particularly struck by the depth of and how far back you went in putting this research together. So about a third of the report just traces the history of this concept in Europe and how it has sort of moved from being partly part of a religious ethos to being a professional responsibility to being a state responsibility, coming back a little bit to being a professional responsibility again. Let's talk a little bit about the state of the field. We've all been working at trying to find ways to mobilize this resource. And how do you see the state? What did the report tell you about where we are in our efforts to mobilize this resource and organize it?
Well, it's undeniable that pro bono in Europe significantly lags behind the US and Australia and other parts of the world. If you just look at statistics from trust law, we can see that if you look at pro bono hours per year per lawyer on average in Europe, we're at around 15 hours, whereas in the US they're at around 60 or 70, and in Australia they're at around 40. So we obviously have a very long way to go in terms of increasing the level of engagement. It's also interesting to note that in Europe, pro bono practice is skewed in several key respects. Firstly, pro bono, and this is probably true globally, but pro bono really hasn't managed to infiltrate anything beyond the large international firms, or at least not substantially. There are exceptions. And also beyond the capital cities. So it's very much an international law firm, capital city phenomenon in Europe. In addition to that, it's skewed in terms of who pro bono is carried out for. So around 85% of pro bono practice in Europe is carried out for nonprofit organizations, meaning that just 15% is carried out for individuals. But we should also recognize that there are important reasons why that is the case. Nonprofit organizations in Europe haven't benefited from a public interest law movement in the way that nonprofit organizations in the US have. And so the report looks at some statistics that show that nonprofits in Europe they're far less legally sophisticated. They very often don't have lawyers on staff. If they do, those lawyers are typically doing governance type work rather than advocacy work. So the argument can be made that nonprofits in Europe need pro bono more than their counterparts in the US. And at the same time, because we have these developed legal aid systems, individuals also will need pro bono less. But having said that, we should of course bear in mind that there are very compelling reasons why individuals in Europe still greatly can benefit from pro bono. The most obvious reason being that we cannot possibly extinguish the need. There's a kind of infinite need. So I would say that's kind of where we are. Not very sufficiently institutionalized, but we're building a kind of a movement.
You mentioned the fact that it's still pretty much a large law firm, capital city phenomenon. This obviously is relevant in the context of closing civil society space, and it contributes potentially to the vulnerability of public interest advocates. So one of the things we've taken from this report is really the call to make sure that we try and get pro bono broadened outside of the capitals and try and work with more local lawyers and perhaps smaller firms to make sure that the culture really draws on a network that is connected and supported by local partners. So that's sort of where the state of the field is right now. What do people that you spoke to think about the future development of the report? And along the way, you came across some interesting debates or hot topics of things that people were perhaps discussing or disagreeing about. Can you tell us just about a couple of those that sort of set the stage for some reflections on where do we go from here?
Sure. So there are some raging debates, and it's important to note that for those who've been involved in pro bono from the very beginning in Europe and beyond, these debates are not new. They've been raging for years, decades even, and they show no signs of going away. But one of the key debates is about how best to deploy pro bono as a resource. And so there are those who favor a kind of a more access to justice oriented approach, which would see lawyers at commercial firms being retrained, skilling up in new areas of law like welfare or asylum, and really helping to shore up frontline services for individuals. And on the other hand, there are those who favor a more sort of expertise-oriented approach, which means taking advantage of the skill sets that commercial lawyers already have. So, for instance, getting lawyers who have expertise in regulatory issues to help nonprofits to play a larger and more effective role in the policy process, or getting lawyers with trade expertise to help developing nations to get a better deal on inward investment. So that's one kind of debate that continues to rage. Another one is about conflicts of interest and the extent to which sort of perceived commercial conflicts, so not strict legal conflicts, but perceived commercial conflicts, act as a sort of inhibitor, or they prevent law firms from engaging in really meaningful structural or systematic work, social justice work. So those are some kind of debates. But I think in terms of the future, one of the key things, thinking specifically about Europe, is that my report kind of reveals is that pro bono in Europe has still failed to fully appreciate and infiltrate the European institutions, the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights, the Commission, the Parliament. Pro bono in Europe hasn't yet managed to take full advantage of those institutions and all that they can achieve in the context of social justice in Europe. And again, the final thing I would say is that pro bono in Europe has also failed to fully take advantage of the broader public interest law movement. There's an enormous clinical movement in Europe, clinical legal education, that PILnet has played a huge role in, and pro bono hasn't really managed to overlap and find ways of working together with that movement yet. Of course, there are exceptions, but I think those are the key issues going forward in Europe.
Lamin, you've done us all a really tremendous service by putting this report together, and I urge you to take the time to find it. You can download it online, and it will be printed in hard copy, and we'll be happy to mail those and get those to you if you want them. This comes at a time when PILnet is itself doing a strategic reflection about where we go from here, thinking not only internally how we can strengthen what we do, but thinking about where the field is going more broadly. And as part of that process, we're hoping to have an extended dialogue with all of you to get input from you as stakeholders in thinking about where we can do better to harness this pro bono resource. Lamin's report identifies some ways where there are barriers that are currently preventing the expertise that exists on the private bar side from really being fully harnessed by those of us on the public bar side. And I come at this as a human rights lawyer. I left South Africa and went to the United States to study human rights because I was frustrated with the tools I had as a lawyer in South Africa, thinking that if I studied human rights, I would have a richer range of tools to fight the social injustice issues in South Africa. I'm now convinced that we're actually neglecting 90% or more of what the legal profession can offer, because those of us on the public sector side tend to use a narrow range of law, often litigation-oriented, strategic litigation tools, whereas most of you as legal professionals are using a far broader range of expertise, particularly in transactional lawyering, that we on the public sector don't quite know how to make effective use of yet. And that to me is a limitation on this rich resource that you have, that I would love PILnet to help with your input, figure out a way that we can change that so that we can really unlock the full potential that you all have, so that when we ask you to do a pro bono project, we're getting you to bring the expertise you bring for your paying clients and making that expertise available to your to those who cannot afford it. To me, that would be the real transformation and a real step forward in harnessing this potential. But there are a lot of problems along the way, and exactly how we do that is still to be worked out, and I don't have the perfect project example to offer you. If one of you do have it, pull me aside and tell me. It would help me a great deal. This process is probably going to take about a year, and I urge you to find opportunities to engage with us. We have a variety of conversations going on, including over the next 3 days. So, Lamin, thank you very much for setting the stage. I will pass it on now to our next speaker, and I urge you all to find the report online and to read it. It's definitely well worth the effort. A lot of work went into it. Thank you.
Thank you.